After the tune, a wonderful conversation about human evolution, science communication and education, and work-life balance with the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History's Dr. Briana Pobiner.
Evolution,
communication,
cognition,
conservation,
behavior,
primatology,
typically primates.
Become the monkey.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on the PrimateCast, our attempt to share the experiences and stories of many people and personalities working in primatology, biological anthropology, and more generally, the fields of wildlife science and evolution. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh, from Kyoto University's Wildlife Research Center, and this program is brought to you by our Center for the International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology, known around here as CICASP. In this episode, we talk to renowned human evolution scientist and science communicator, Dr. Briana Pobiner, from the Anthropology Department at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. Briana has graduate degrees from Rutgers University, and in addition to her role at the museum, also serves as Associate Research Professor in the Department of Anthropology at George Washington University. Briana's anthropological research focuses on understanding the human diet and changes therein over the past few million years. An overarching theme throughout the interview is encapsulated by a question you can find on the Smithsonian's Human Origins website. What does it mean to be human? In answering this question, Briana talks about the human connection being key to what makes us, but also how our evolving diets relate to various aspects of our behavior and evolution. We try to get a little deeper into some of the methods used in paleoanthropology, the only time machines we currently have access to, and the kinds of questions that can be answered using them. And, spoiler alert, Briana shares that her favorite hominin is Homo erectus, and she explains why. She talks about ancient humans sharing the environments with various carnivores, like the ancestors of modern African savanna species like lions, leopards, cheetahs, and hyenas, but also about the now absent saber-toothed cats, and how that contributed to our own evolution of meat consumption. The picture she paints of what it must have been like, and even how we might really see ourselves in the various ancient hominin species that have come before us, really hits home the idea that we're all part of a family that has deep, deep roots. It's clear from the beginning of this interview that Briana is just such a wonderful communicator, and we talk at length about how she's worked to reach different audiences and improve both science communication and education, even to groups that have traditionally been, or more recently have become, aversive to scientific messaging. One of the pieces of advice she offers really hit home with me as a podcast host and producer, and that was the need to find your own tool for science communication. But there's so much else to digest here, and I couldn't be happier to be able to share it all right here on the PrimateCast. We end the interview with a discussion of work-life balance and the importance of broadening the discussion of how women can succeed in the natural sciences, particularly those requiring stints in the field, and how we should showcase the many models already out there paving the way forward. Before getting into the interview, though, I want to also highlight that I have a co-host for this interview. Doctoral candidate Kasia Majewski was the one to suggest and arrange this interview, with a nod to George Washington graduate student Elaine Miller for the tip. Kasia is a wonderful naturalist and science communicator, and I think you can see from the interview just how engaged and passionate she really is about science and about its broad dissemination. This was Kasia's first interview for the PrimateCast, but regular listeners of recent episodes at least might recognize her voice as the one that delivers the end credits for the show. I hope you'll agree that we'll want to have more of Kasia on the program in the future. But until then, here is our interview with Dr. Briana Pobiner, starting with a nod to another recent guest on the PrimateCast. So this is just totally random thing, but when I was doing a little bit of background research for this, actually it was not for this podcast. It was recently we released a lecture that was done for us by John Mitani months ago, and we have this international primatology lecture series thing where we ask a lot of kind of well-known and kind of near end of career people to speak to our graduate group. And he gave such a wonderful talk, and I asked him if I could put the audio up on the podcast. So I was looking for how to connect with him in social media. And then you were the first person that came up on Facebook when I typed in John Mitani. And it was something it was something really wonderful. You wrote about him nearing his retirement when he was awarded, I think he was awarded something from the American Association of Physical Anthropologists or something. But so it seems like your careers intertwined quite early on in yours.
Yeah, and it was really random, actually. So it's a great story. He reviewed my NSF graduate research fellowship proposal. I did not know this at all. But he comes up to me at an American Association of Physical Anthropologists, now Biological Anthropologists conference, looks at my name tag and goes, "Oh, you're Briana Pobiner, and you're studying tooth marks on bones." And I'm like, "Who is this short Japanese man? Like, I don't even know you." He was so friendly, but he said, I read your proposal. I thought it was wonderful. I did get the NSF graduate research fellowship. And he said, and actually, if you'd be interested, we have this collection of monkey bones that have been chewed on by chimpanzees. Would you like to look at it? And I said, yeah. So I studied this collection in Michigan. We published a paper together, and actually I was awarded like the Primate Research Prize for the ABA or APA, like for that paper. It was just, and I have just had such affection and fondness for him. I love seeing him at conferences, and and he's a wonderful speaker.
He was, I mean, he did. Yeah, it was such a great, really inspirational talk that he gave to us. So he's certainly quickly became one of my favorite humans that we've interacted with.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, especially in this field, like he's just, and I like a lot of people in our field, but he's I agree, he's up there.
Awesome. So I think, Kasia, you can take it right from there, right? You have something very relevant to being a good human.
Absolutely. So I'm actually going to borrow some words from the Smithsonian webpage that I noticed on the Human Origin Initiative introduction page. Right at the top, there's a big banner that asks, "What does it mean to be human?" And it's such a provocative question. There's also a chat box there where all the visitors to the webpage can actually answer that question for themselves, what they think it means to be human. And of course, the researchers in the anthropology section endeavor to answer this question through their research as well. So this is the first question I have for you today. If you could answer it for us through the lens of your research.
That's a great question. And I was just thinking to myself, wait, did I answer that? Because I feel like every time I think about that question, it is the theme question of the Human Origins Initiative. Every time I think about it, just depending on what's going on in my life, I would give a different answer.
Perfect.
And before I give my answer, I will say that the question is worded very deliberately, not how did we become human, but it's what does it mean to be human? Because it's about meaning and how we draw meaning from things. And a lot of scientists, we draw meaning from our work, but we realize that like humanity and what it means goes far beyond science. I guess, right now I would answer that question about probably like connections and love and family because of things going on in my life right now. I mean, I guess I would probably always answer it that way. But being human means to be in community and connected to other people. It means lots of other things too, though.
Absolutely. So, and I find that really interesting how also you kind of tie into this idea of community and network and the way that we are today, how we've become, to our evolution of diet as well. And these topics as well that you've studied have been so fascinating, like human cannibalism and chimpanzee carnivory, the way that you've managed to kind of connect them into this central theme. I'd love to hear more about that as well.
Sure. So my big research questions are about the evolution of human diets, and I often put a plural on that now, diets, because I don't think there is a single ancient ancestral diet. And the connection between human cannibalism and chimpanzee carnivory is in general about meat eating, but it's also about the method that I use to study human diets. There's lots of different methods that can be used, which is one of the things that I think makes the study of ancient diets really interesting. The method that I use is looking at marks on bones, either left by early humans wielding stone knives, or carnivores chewing on bones, or, in the case of human cannibalism, it's humans leaving marks on other humans. In the case of chimpanzee carnivory, it's chimpanzees chewing on their prey. But I'm really interested in basically the history of bones in a sense, and what those marks can tell us about actual interactions in the past. I think it's really tough oftentimes to really reconstruct ancient behavior, but those marks on bones are like little snapshots in time about an interaction that actually happened in the past, and that's really cool.
I think we'll come back a little bit to the kinds of evidence that you use to tell the stories that are coming out of your work and work of others. But I kind of want to dig a little bit into the diet. So I think there have been a lot of changes in how we understand the evolution of the genus Homo over the past few million years. And I'm wondering, so when exactly did that shift happen where we went from much more omnivorous to much more carnivorous as a species?
Yeah, so that's a big question. And I think I would characterize us as still omnivorous. I think there has been an addition through our evolutionary history of more meat, and depending on the species, I mean, Neanderthals seem to have eaten a lot of meat. They also seem to have eaten a whole variety of plants. And as far as the fossil evidence goes, the earliest, I think, really solid evidence for the incorporation of meat, particularly from big animals in the diet, and that's what makes it archaeologically visible, goes back about 2.5, 2.6 million years. There's one site that's older than that, Dakika in Ethiopia, which has a few fossil bones that might have butchery marks on it. Those are pretty hotly contested, but it seems like starting about 2.5 million years ago, we see this occasional evidence for carnivory. There are sites with a handful of modified bones. Starting about 2 million years ago, particularly at the site of Kengera South in Kenya, we see a place where early humans basically transported carcasses, many carcasses, and butchered them, maybe shared them. And this happened over time in the same place. So in our even scientific paper, we called it persistent carnivory. So the place where early humans were bringing carcasses to butcher over and over again. And we know that because the fossils of those butchered animals were found in 3 different layers that span maybe 1,000 years of time. So that seems to have been a shift. Sometime between then and about 1.5 million years ago, we start to see early humans probably not just scavenging or getting leftovers or doing this opportunistically, but starting to actually be able to get meat from the meatier parts of carcasses, maybe get earlier access to these animals. Probably still not hunting. At least we don't have good archaeological evidence for hunting technology until 500,000 years ago. But somehow the hominins were getting access to juicy parts of carcasses. So there's interesting questions about like what were those interactions like, and how did they interact with carnivores, and who got there first, and how can we tell from the fossils?
Yeah. So just to kind of dig a bit more on that, like a few weeks ago in my comparative cognition class, I was talking with students about this. I think it's George Streiter's Principles of Brain Evolution. It was a book from early 2000s. And then there was a short article, like a précis made about it. But he was talking about these 2 major jumps in human brain size. And I think one of them happened, let's say, somewhere between 2.5 to 1 million years ago. And then another one happened maybe much more recently in Homo sapiens. And so in that article, I don't know the updated information on this, but in that article, he suggests that probably there are 2 dominant reasons for the shifts. And the first one was probably diet related. So that I assume that's much more related to meat consumption, and you could talk about expensive brains and things like that. And then the second one was maybe more social, but you also mentioned that, so hunting and then this kind of collective behavior around meat scavenging. And so I wonder, like for you, how you see that kind of relationship between dietary shifts and other parts of human evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think, diet is such a fundamental, like what an organism eats is such a fundamental part of what that organism is, how it makes its way in the world, all kinds of different aspects of its adaptation, behavior, physiology. So it seems to me to make good sense that if there is a significant shift in diet, that would be related to either, evolutionary pressures, or it would result in different adaptations. Interestingly, though, from my understanding, I think updated information is that brain size in our genus, in the genus Homo, increased there was definitely a shift between Australopithecus and Homo, but that shift really was in line with an increase in body size. So relative brain size didn't get a lot bigger or really take off until about 1 million years ago. And then you see this big uptick in absolute and relative brain size. And so the expensive tissue hypothesis, the idea that our brains are very energetically expensive, and how do we possibly fuel that? And how did that happen in evolutionary history? And there's been a longstanding idea that meat was that high quality, package of resources that had a lot of protein and fat, and incorporating more meat into the diet is essentially what kind of released a selective pressure to allow brains to expand, or at least was the fuel that allowed brains to expand due to other selective pressures for larger brains. But the timing doesn't really work anymore from what we know about that increase in brain size. And what we do see at about 1 million years ago is some of the earliest evidence for cooking. So it might not be a new kind of food, it might be a new way to process food.
Mm-hmm. That ties a lot into, I think I've read Richard Wrangham's book, Catching Fire. And so this really interesting too, how they also look at what non-human primates, so like chimpanzees, for example, whether or not they have similar preferences to cooked food. And some of our colleagues at Kyoto University have also done similar studies with sweet potato, which is an iconic food in Japan. And it does seem like the chimpanzees preferred the cooked versions as well. So there seems to be this pre-existing preference for that as well, once we can unlock the potential.
Exactly. And I'm also a big fan of Richard Wrangham's Catching Fire book. I think it's really compelling.
Speaking of books, you mentioned Neanderthals a little bit earlier in this as well, and sort of branching out into how broad our ancestry actually is. It reminds me of Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, and he kind of bridges this idea of what makes us sort of the dominant or main species, why we were so successful, why Homo sapiens was so successful. And it often kind of gets me thinking about what really sets Homo sapiens apart from our ancestors. If you have a favorite Homo species, maybe that you would like to talk about today, I don't know if it's Homo sapiens, maybe it's another one. And maybe even if you could paint for us a picture of what a day in the life of your favorite Homo species, what that would look like.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard not to have us as my favorite species, but probably because of what I study, my favorite Homo species is Homo erectus. It is the species that we start to see the incorporation of more meat and really just broadening of the diet in general. It is the species where we see a more modern human-like body size and shape, but also it's kind of, I know it's extinct, but in a sense, it's an evolutionary winner because of all of the species on the human family tree, it was around the longest for several times longer than Homo sapiens has been around. I hope we catch up at some point. What was a day in the life of Homo erectus like? If I had a time machine, that's where I would go in time, because I would love to. I can envision, small groups of individuals foraging on, African savanna landscapes, avoiding predators, but maybe also trying to see where they're going, maybe seeing if they could scavenge some food, having social interactions with each other. The interesting thing also about Homo erectus is that they shared the landscape with probably several other species of hominins. So were they interacting with those other species? Did they recognize them as something similar? So I spend a lot of time doing field work in African savanna landscapes. And every once in a while, it's fun to imagine, like, what would it be like if these hominins were still around? And how different would they be from people today? I think they would be, different enough that you would not think it was your long lost cousin. But I think similar enough. They were bipedal. They kind of generally looked like us very broadly. So I think there would be some sort of recognition, maybe.
It's fascinating to think about that, isn't it? How maybe they didn't have the daily commute and the lunch break that we do, that kind of schedule, but maybe there's a lot more similarities between us than we can even imagine. So I hope you get your time machine maybe someday. Maybe some big grant will come through sometime. Yeah.
Well, it seems like the current time machine of the day is just developing new methods on how we can extract as much information as possible from the remains that are out there. So can you maybe talk a little bit about specifically when you're in the field or in the lab, how is it that you extract information about early diets and shifts in diets?
Sure. That's a great, and I love the idea of thinking about our methods as time machines to be able to kind of reconstruct the past. So when I'm in the lab, when I'm doing lab work, I'm generally studying fossil collections, looking for butchery marks left by ancient humans, or looking for carnivore tooth marks and chewing damage left by ancient predators. A lot of that is actually pretty simple from a methodological perspective. It's, looking at the surfaces of fossils, making sure the light that I'm using is just at the right angle so that if there are any marks on these fossils, they would kind of pop out to me. I use a hand lens or, some sort of a magnifying glass. But it's really a lot of time spent looking at fossil surfaces carefully, seeing if I can see these traces of ancient interactions between those, once, recently dead bones, now completely fossilized bones, with anything in their environment that would have left a mark on them.
So one of my good colleagues here in the International Center where I work, Susumu Tomiya, he's a vertebrate paleontologist as well. And he studied mostly fossil carnivorans and focused mainly in North America. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask on his behalf, not that he put me up to it or anything, but what kinds of carnivores are we dealing with throughout the different stages of human evolution that they might have been competing with as their diet shifted more into meat eating?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's an important one. So a lot of and because most of my research is in the last 2 million years or so in Africa, that's generally what I'm thinking about with sort of earlier humans. So the carnivore guild, or the, carnivores that would have been around, include ancient relatives, but pretty similar to modern lions, leopards, cheetah, even things like wild dog, spotted hyena, striped hyena. There are some, ancient now extinct species that were the ancestors of those living animals. But what we don't have today that was also present during the time of human evolution is saber-toothed cats. There were several different genera of saber-toothed cats that were around right from the time that early humans were starting to eat meat. And there have been some hypotheses that some saber-toothed cats, some of them were bigger than today's lions. Some of them may have been solitary when they caught their prey, because saber-toothed cats, based on comparisons of their jaws and teeth to other living predators, they seem to be flesh specialists. They might have eaten quite a bit of flesh off their prey, but left a lot behind, especially if they were solitary and not social. And they did not have the kind of jaws that hyenas have that can actually crunch up bone. So an early hominin that had a stone tool could slice that leftover meat off of bones, but also break the bones open to get at marrow inside. And so fatty marrow, I suspect, would have been a great commodity on the African savanna even a couple million years ago.
So I saw that, and maybe you mentioned it when we were leading up to this interview, that you were preparing for a TEDx talk for TEDx Johannesburg. And so I had a peek at the speakers there. So this was, I don't know, it might've been the first, but kind of paleoscience TED specific event. Can you maybe just talk about what you presented there and how it kind of fit into the broader theme, and then maybe transition into kind of, well, we can wait for that later. Yeah, just about that TED event.
Well, and interestingly, when I talked to the TED folks initially, I said I could talk about two different things. I could talk about my research on early human diets, or I could talk about the outreach I do and how I try to, communicate about human evolution. And they said, that second one sounds great because we don't have anybody else doing that. So that's what I ended up talking about, actually, is our work with a traveling exhibit with curriculum materials that I developed for high school classes. And so just my variety of experiences. I also work with, help train volunteers in our museum. I run social media accounts. I help keep our website up to date. So all these different facets of outreach. But I mostly talked about interactions that I've had with the public in facilitating public programs and also with our traveling library exhibit.
So I think we're going to get quite a bit into the outreach and education side of it in a moment. But before we transition to there, I just want to ask you then two questions. The first one is, this might be hard. Like I was going to say, what was your favorite thing you learned at this TED conference on paleoscience, or something that just caught your interest? And the second part of that is, in your own research, what are the kind of burning questions that you feel you need to answer next?
Yeah, good question. So unfortunately, because of the time difference, so I did not participate live in the TEDx conference in Johannesburg. I pre-recorded the talk because it started at like 3 or 3:30 in the morning my time. Right. But I did catch a couple of talks, and really my favorite one was just about discovery and the fossil record, and just the excitement of finding new fossils. That's all I will say, because I think, this whole lineup is going to be worth watching. And tell me what your second question was, because I lost it already.
The second question was, in your own research. Yeah. I mean, maybe you could just quickly comment on, what you're doing at the moment, and also what are the kind of really burning questions that are on your agenda? Yeah,
good question. So, it's interesting. Some of the most exciting things I'm finding these days are in museum collections that we're going back and studying, because people haven't looked at them to look to see if they're butchery marks. So I won't give any spoilers, but I'm working on two different projects that I think we've identified butchery marks in places and times and on sorts of organisms that haven't been seen before or are older than evidence before. So as much as I love fieldwork, and pulling fossils out of the ground is incredibly exciting, or the fieldwork that I do in modern environments where I walk around looking for modern bones, but also I feel like I'm sort of excavating museum samples and, basically shining new light on things that have been sitting on a dusty shelf for a long time. So that's fun too.
Because museum things are fascinating to me too. I recently came across a podcast. I haven't looked at it yet. I think it's called Side Door, and it might even be, is it even connected to Smithsonian?
Yeah, it's a Smithsonian podcast. And I was a guest on that within the last couple of months.
Okay. Yeah, I asked a similar question to my colleague Susumu, because he also is kind of a museum. I don't want to, troller sounds like a bad word, museum trawler. I'm not sure, but there's so much, it seems like there's so much treasure in there that can be discovered or re-examined or rediscovered. And so that's, really, really interesting.
No, it's a really good way to put it. I think museums are full of treasure, actually.
It's definitely a different way of excavating, and can be just as fruitful. I never worked with specimens, taxidermied specimens, or objects, but I was an assistant curator at Manchester Museum for about 3 years. I worked with a live collection that they had there, which was quite unusual. But I did marvel. We had 5 million objects in the collection, and it was only 5 years ago that they discovered that some of the bird species or specimens that they had in the collection actually belonged to and were collected by Darwin. And they didn't know. They were holding on to them for so long. So it really is a different method of excavation, isn't it?
And I love the idea that these collections and like even individual specimens can like yield new information over and over again, with new questions, with new methods, with, new eyes.
That's precisely it. And as technology moves forward as well, we can learn so many new things as well. That's brilliant. It's great to hear, get caught up with where your research is heading. We're really excited to stay tuned and see what happens next. And in lieu of this, and this mention of TEDx and outreach, that's one thing that really struck me, is your success both in research and with outreach as well. That's such an important part of communicating science, being able to reach people and share that information. I really want to hear more about what that process was like for you, from moving from research into outreach.
Yeah, it's a great question. It was very fortuitous, because in graduate school, I think like most graduate students, you're being trained to go into traditional tenure track academia. There wasn't much conversation about any alternative pathways, but I always had a little bit of reservation of, I love teaching, and I love research, but how am I going to change the world with that? A little bit of idealistic reservation in a sense. And having the opportunity to join the team in the Human Origins program at the Smithsonian, initially to help put together the Hall of Human Origins, which is a permanent exhibit on human evolution that millions of people visit every year. So that was an incredible opportunity for which I had zero training and background, but I was willing to jump in with 2 feet and go, yes, I'm happy to work on the curatorial team, doing all the background research and working with the designers and working with the writer and all of this stuff. And during the process, I got really interested, or more interested, I guess, in public engagement with science. And Rick Potts, who's the director of the Human Origins program, the curator of the Hall of Human Origins, and my supervisor, had really had a vision for as we call it in the museum now, sort of a hybrid between a scientist and an educator, but someone who has done and continues to do authentic research, so can speak to the excitement and the process and the what is it like under the hood if you open things up, and be able to communicate those sorts of things with the public. And so I just feel really fortunate to have found this non-existent career path, in a sense, where I'm able to continue doing my research, which is part of my job, but also spending a lot of time doing education and outreach, and also working. My job is in the anthropology department, which is in the science research side of things, but I also function as a member of the Office of Education. So I work on larger education teams, and I learn so much, I feel like, every day from my education colleagues. So I've learned all of that really on the job. And now I've also started doing education research, which feels comfortable to me because I'm a researcher. But certainly the education part is kind of a new facet and something that I really enjoy.
It sounds like you've really taken ownership over sharing that research, and it seems like you love it. That love comes across, and that passion certainly comes across. I wonder if you think that going forward, is it the responsibility of researchers to make that research available to all, or is that more of a systemic responsibility? Or now that outreach is becoming more talked about, whose shoulders do you think that responsibility should fall on?
That's a great question. And the answer is everyone's. I think as much as possible for individual researchers to make research accessible, whether it's through, writing an article for a place like Smithsonian Magazine, or the conversation on the paper you published last week and making it digestible and understandable for the public, whether it's writing a tweet thread, whether it's, going to your local public school and walking into a 4th grade classroom and bringing some objects and, talking with kids about your research. But I also do think that there's, the scientific enterprise, in a sense, also has a collective responsibility to do this and to lean on the research of social scientists and science communication researchers who, there's a whole research field on how to do this well. And scientists, we should not have to reinvent the wheel. We should look at evidence-based research on how to communicate well. Sometimes that goes against first of all, we're not trained to do this in graduate school. And also some of it even might go against our instincts of, I just want to tell everybody about the really cool esoteric thing I found, but that may not be where your audience is coming from. So taking a step back and, thinking about some of the basic principles of science communication research is a really important first step.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that I had this question that I was trying to formulate well for you, and I was stuck on some aspects of the vocabulary and some aspects of the phrasing. But it really is that we have a very specific training as scientists, and I think everybody can appreciate that it's more important. It's as important now as it ever has been to be able to communicate with a much broader audience, not just about the esoterics of what we're doing, but just the general importance of that. And maybe just to maybe it won't be embarrassing for you, but I'm going to try and read 4 titles in the last couple of years of articles that you've published. And the range is kind of stark for me. So, for example, you've published or been a co-author on papers called A New Semi-Quantitative Method for Coding Carnivore Chewing Damage with an Application to Modern African Lion Damaged Bones. and also no sustained increase in zooarchaeological evidence for carnivory after the appearance of Homo erectus, or my favorite, a chomped chimp, new evidence of tooth marks on an adult chimpanzee, Pan-troglodytes virus, but also titles like Kenyan biology teachers experience teaching evolution and acknowledging students' concerns about evolution, a proactive teaching strategy. So it's really clear that you're able to balance. I mean, I'm actually struggling to figure out how it's possible to manage to be publishing really important works in very different fields. Like, of course, the central theme here is that you're teaching evolution to scientists and for the field, and also to broad audiences. But what is the process like for you to be able to move between doing those very different kinds of work?
That's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked it in quite that framing, which I really like, actually.
Thank you.
Because I feel like I had to become bilingual. And it's speaking the language of and writing the language of science research. That first title that you wrote, as I was like grimacing, it is so technical and specific. And learning the language of education research, and also learning how to write more for the public, which I've done, in different ways. It really is, there's code switching, there's, using different language. When I moved into adding education research to kind of my research portfolio, it was really choosing wonderful collaborators that have helped me understand that world. And leaning on them. And I don't ever do research by myself, really. So, working with my collaborators has been the best learning process. But it really, I actually don't have a good aptitude for foreign languages, but I suspect that folks who really are bilingual or trilingual, this is the kind of thing that they do. So I'm just multi-research lingual or something like that.
So one thing that I as the kind of host and producer and co-host today of a podcast, I mean, obviously this is something that's important to me, and I feel like I can and should be doing more. But one thing that in some ways has made me a bit hesitant is that when we write scientific papers, we're so concerned about making sure that everything we say can be traced back to a very specific source. Every piece of evidence we provide fits the story that we're trying to tell. And I know that when you transition into talking to much broader audiences, sometimes we have to deviate a bit from that in order to get a clearer message, or maybe rely a lot more on metaphor, which sometimes is challenging for scientists as well. And then also there's this issue of, as we mentioned, esoteric nature of some of our work. Yeah. It's hard sometimes for people to see in what direction should you take your public engagement with science based on what you're an expert in. And I think it can be challenging to deviate from your expertise. And so I wonder if maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, I guess the advice that I would give is that it's not about deviating from your expertise. It's about what are the questions that really interest you? What are the really exciting findings? And figuring out how to take those and translate them for the public. If you are a researcher on bacteria and you have found this amazing new thing about this bacteria, your excitement about it will come through. So I think it's figuring out, that first paper that I wrote was basically, the question was, can we tell what carnivore ate something by the chewing damage that it left? Here's a lion example. That's how I would translate that. And, I think it's really exciting because if we want to understand the carnivores in the past that ancient humans were interacting with, and we don't have their fossils, how do we know they were there? We know because, we might know if we can tell what their chewing damage looked like. When a lion or a leopard or a cheetah or a hyena chews on something, does it look different? And this is a start in kind of figuring that out. But I think that's one thing. The other thing is that, one of the questions that as scientists we get asked all the time is, how is your research relevant and why does it matter? And sometimes that question is more difficult to answer if it's just, I don't know, this is a cool question and I want to investigate it. But I think in those, and not every bit of research that we do necessarily has, immediate impact or strong relevance. But I think in those instances, if we can start with storytelling and why is this question interesting? How is it, engaging to us? What did we used to know? What did we find out? Like, what questions does it generate? I mean, I think, and the other thing that struck me with your question is you were talking about doing this podcast. And I think one important thing to figure out on a science communication journey is, what's the medium that you like to communicate in? Is it a podcast? Is it writing? Is it Twitter? And figuring out, where's your comfort zone? What do you like to do? What do you feel good at? And who's the audience you're trying to reach? And make sure it's the, medium and the audience, and joining those things together. Maybe you're amazing at like sitting next to somebody on the bus and talking about your research. Maybe that is not something you like to do. But maybe you're great with your neighbor's kids and, getting them to think scientifically. So I feel like every scientist probably has a science communication lane that is really comfortable to them. And so it's just a case of finding it out and then playing around in there and practicing it.
Definitely. I completely agree. And I can see that you can tell which researchers have really discovered their passion in a tool set that they can use to communicate that passion as well. And I guess what makes me curious also is how did you find your tool set as a science communicator? Because we've addressed now the needs that you need to identify to start science communication, but what kind of tools and how did you gather them to be able to communicate effectively? Do science communication conferences, are they helpful to attend? Like, what kind of resources would you recommend exploring for budding science communicators and researchers?
Great question. So absolutely, science communication conferences are wonderful. A lot of just straight academic conferences now will have workshops on science communication, or, you can take science communication like, individual classes or workshops, or, your university might have some kind of resources. And I constantly still seek out resources. I will, anytime I'm anywhere that there's a science communication workshop, sign me up, because I learned something new at every one of these workshops. There's a nugget that I take with me, whether it's let me workshop this thing I'm interested in communicating and I haven't quite figured out how to do it right yet. And so it's really just, I think it's looking for those opportunities for training by folks who this is their expertise. It's also taking a look around you and figuring out who's doing it well in the medium you like. Not that you should necessarily like copy them, but just get a sense of, okay, how are they doing it so well? What are they doing that really strikes you? And sort of trying to incorporate some of those tools and techniques. The journey is never done. It is like any skill. You will, hone it and practice it. And all of that just makes it better.
I think it's a good place to transition into the specifics of what you're communicating to the public. And so as somebody who studies human evolution, I guess it's not a far-fetched to have transitioned to the person who communicates evolution to the public. And I think you've done a lot in using human evolution examples to kind of help facilitate that process. But let me start this transition by giving a couple of poll stats. You wrote a 2016 paper about acceptance, kind of general acceptance of evolution in the public. And I followed that over to John Miller's earlier paper as well on a more global perspective on that. I know that you focus more on the United States and some other specific examples, but since those papers have come out, I was trying to find some of the more recent data, and it looks promising in some respects. I know that within the US, it seems to have jumped a bit to over 50% now, people who kind of accept that humans developed from earlier ancestors, and then with or without God in the process somehow is one thing that's very specific to the US, maybe, and very different from Japan, I might add. So where we are right now, even in that earlier Miller paper, Japan is near the top of the list in terms of acceptance of evolution. And even more than that, it was really only 10% of the population that abjectly refused to believe. So it's probably 80% or around there, 75 to 80%. And Tasha and I are both from Canada, so we were happy to see that Canadians as well, like 75% of us kind of are not averse to the idea that we evolved over time. But I wonder if you can maybe talk then about what the trends are currently in kind of understanding and accepting evolution as a a likely process, and maybe what the major factors are that determine people. Is it all mostly religious underpinnings? Is it economic status? Is it education level?
Great question. And actually, John Miller wrote a wonderful, not exactly a follow-up paper to that earlier paper that was more of a global perspective, but wrote a paper in 2021 with colleagues that was, what has happened in the US over time. And yeah, it's been, whether you look at the Gallup poll data or the Pew data, there has been a slow increase in acceptance of evolution in the US to where, like you said, over 50% of people, depending on whether or not they think God guided the process, accept evolution. So that was like hugely exciting when that statistic came out. I think it was in 2019. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I think there's a variety of factors that people have looked at that influence acceptance of evolution. Oftentimes they're not independent. So age is a factor, education level is a factor, religiosity is a factor. That can be measured in a variety of different ways. Usually in poll data, it's measured as how often do you go to church or some kind of religious service. But really, it's often more about your sort of community and the community norms and beliefs. If your community is a more conservative, religious, church-going, there are in general kind of things and ideas that are acceptable and ideas that community generally rejects. So, yes, religiosity is probably the biggest factor, particularly in the US, but also another one is political affiliation. And that is kind of unique to the US, not entirely, but politics, religion, evolution, all those things I think interact in a fairly unique way in the US. And there have been larger trends about science denial. There have been larger trends about like rejection of expertise and experts. And I think a lot of these like really play into this. It's not the same thing, but there's a lot of interesting research into rejection of climate change as well. Some similar factors, some different there. If religion might be the largest driving factor in rejection of evolution, economics tends to be the largest one in rejection of climate change. But, there are a lot of researchers that go, it actually doesn't matter whether you understand any of this at all. It's really just your, kind of culture and community norm and what goes along with that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, the climate change thing. So one of the polls that I return to often when I'm teaching, and then just for this podcast as well, was that Pew Research poll, I think from 2015 or something, that surveyed the general public in the US and then the AAAS members. For human evolution, it was a big gap. For climate change was maybe the biggest. It's something like 90% of AAAS members, and only, 40% of American public believed climate change had a human influence or a origin. But specifically during the pandemic, I think there's been a lot of discussion of how the public trust in scientists has eroded as well. And I wonder how, in your experience, you've seen that, like maybe over your years as a science communicator and educator, and then maybe specifically with the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there are some really interesting articles out there about that, about, it's part of, I think, a longer term trend of mistrust and distrust in science. But I think particularly communicating about the complexity of COVID-19 and about, public health measures. And I think, acceptance of evolution doesn't tend to you don't have to change your lifestyle because of it most of the time, I would imagine. But, if you reject basic information about an infectious disease, it can condition what you do on an everyday basis. And so, yeah, I think there's some disturbing and interesting trends about anti-science rhetoric. And again, I think it's wrapped up in this anti-expert, everybody can do their own research. The democratization of information unfortunately, while I think it's absolutely a net positive, but it has also allowed people to kind of find anything they want to back up their ideas somewhere online. So I think like librarians and other folks that teach about information literacy are just crucial in the wake of all of this.
Recently, Svante Pabo was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine, and I think that'll be the first time that an anthropologist has been awarded with such a prestigious prize. And I wonder, like, does that factor in any way to how you think about your messaging for human evolution? And does it open new pathways to discussion, or does it somehow lend credibility? I mean, we don't necessarily think of a Nobel Prize being necessary for credibility in the field, but I just wonder, how you see that kind of playing out in a broader sphere of messaging about human evolution.
Yeah, it's a great question. It was so exciting. And also, I think what I just really enjoyed seeing was like my colleagues be so excited about this, my straight up scientific colleagues going, this is just amazing. And I don't, like you said, we don't need this for credibility, but for visibility, I think it's really exciting for, people who are less science-oriented, science-friendly going, oh, there's ancient DNA and you can study it and it could tell us something about ancient humans and human evolution. That's cool. So I think just, the status of a prize like that might just get people who haven't been interested in human evolution, maybe they'll be interested in reading about it now. So anything like that helps. So it was very exciting.
I was listening to another one of your interviews. You had actually mentioned a run-in that you had with it might have been a public event where a family came up to you and they were very excited to meet you and to hear more about your research. But they did say, we believe in science. Absolutely. We have no problem with science. It's just evolution that, we really have an issue with. And that's just not something we're going to accept. And it really makes me wonder, we were talking about the Science Communicator Toolkit. What kind of tool can you pull out in that moment? Yeah. The mantra of a science communicator is know your audience. And what if what you know about your audience is that there's this seemingly insurmountable gap, cultural gap or ideological gap? How can you still build bridges with these communities or this audience, even in lieu of this, and knowing that?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a good way to put it. How do you possibly build a bridge in that situation? And the tool that I pull out in that situation is actually a shift in my own goal. And so instead of a goal for that interaction being, I want to tell them about my specific research on 1.5 million year old fossils from Kenya. No, my goal for that interaction, once I understand that, my audience, the person who I'm talking to, rejects evolution, my goal for that interaction is for them to have a positive interaction with a scientist. I want them to feel heard. I want them to feel listened to. I want them to, even though if we have, a very different perspective on how the world works, I want them to walk away not feeling like, oh, that was an elitist jerk scientist. No, I want them to walk away going, oh, like that was another mom who I could talk to about this. And we care about X, Y, Z that are the same thing. So the tool that I pull out is the how do I find a point of connection that probably at this point has nothing to do with science. Maybe we're from the same place. Maybe we, like the same food, but some way that I can connect with that person where they walk away with a positive feeling.
I love that. I love that as a tool to address these systemic issues, that actually the huge part of science communication is knowing how to listen, like letting your audience feel heard and letting them feel a part of that conversation rather than just lectured to. What a message to take forward as we continue to forge through science communication and figuring out how to do it effectively.
Yeah. So maybe Briana, if you don't mind, I'll throw out some classics at you here and you can maybe tell us how you might handle that. So one of the things, maybe you'll get where I'm going, is why are chimps still chimps?
Yeah. So it's funny. I was a co-author on a paper in the American Biology Teacher Journal that started with that. Why are chimps still chimps? And actually, that might have been the title of the entire paper. And what we did was unpack all of the misconceptions behind that question. The misconception that modern humans evolved from living chimpanzees. The misconception that evolution is linear and one species always evolves into the other. And so, if somebody asked me that question, I would often say, I would say, well, chimps are doing a great job at what they're doing. There's no reason to think that chimps would evolve into humans as if humans were the pinnacle of evolution. And that we share a common ancestor with living chimps. And that common ancestor was, some kind of fossil ape that was probably kind of chimp-like.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier my class in comparative cognition. One of the ways I start that is by explaining to everyone that everything that's alive today has been evolving for exactly the same amount of time. And I think that's not that easy for everyone to wrap their minds around, And so just maybe it's our early education or maybe it's just this kind of anthropocentrism that we have naturally to think about us as this kind of focal species. But it's certainly something that comes up.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's both of those. And it's also, there have been really interesting studies with kids that these misconceptions of like teleology, of there having to be sort of a driving force behind something, about like the inevitability of evolution and that things are striving. Those are misconceptions that are super common in kids. And, unless we're really careful with our language and, how we're teaching about kind of even the building blocks about evolution, it's actually not difficult for those kind of misconceptions to get cemented. And also, evolution is somewhat counterintuitive. So I think, the idea, it's a very intuitive idea that like things are changing for the better. Doesn't that make sense? Why, so I think, some of this is really on scientists to communicate it more clearly, and teachers and other folks. Yeah.
The second one I wanted to throw out at you, and I think this one's even more in your wheelhouse, is about maybe the paleo fantasy that is the paleo diet, or how should we interpret this kind of, I don't know how current it is now, but people often try to use evolutionary arguments for guiding, let's say, maybe trying to scientize their decisions about what they're going to eat and how. And yeah, maybe you want to riff on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, stay tuned because I'm actually in the beginning stages of writing a popular book on that, or at least a book proposal. So, because it's something that I hear so often, and there are several, again, sort of underlying misconceptions about that. The misconception that there was one single ancestral diet that our, ancestors ate and they were in perfect harmony with their environment and it led to long, healthy lives, disease-free lives. No, none of that is true. And I think also some of this stems from the idea that the past was a rosy place. And we want to go back to that place again, where we were sort of more in harmony with our environments, but also the idea that we are evolved to eat certain kinds of food. The idea that, and these foods are optimal for us, instead of thinking about the amazing variation in humans across the globe, and that people in different cultures have for thousands and, tens of thousands and really millions of years been eating food that is local to their environments, that humans can evolve very quickly in order to adapt to eating different kinds of foods. And that it's really our dietary flexibility as opposed to eating specific foods. I mean, I often joke, the paleo diet is about not eating things. I can't think of a paleo person that would look at something edible and go, oh, no, that's not in my diet. I don't think that's how it worked. So it's, and I know that comes from the idea that, well, we've only been eating XYZ food for, this certain amount of time, and we haven't had enough time to evolve to, digest it. But just more and more, that's evidence shows that none of that is the case.
Brilliant. So food is both part of what makes us human. Food and diet is part of what makes us human. And it's also shrouded in lots of misconceptions, it sounds like. So looking forward to that. Yes, I can't wait to read more about that in your book. That's very exciting news. And it kind of brings us back nicely as well to that initial question of what makes us human, and your first answer as well, which was also now extending to community and family. And I did want to touch on that just as we round the bend on today, because you recently did have an article that came out about being a mother and motherhood in STEM. And I was saying to Andrew actually just before we met up for today's podcast that I think in that article is the very first picture I have ever seen of a woman pregnant in the field and undertaking field work. It's just not talked about. It's just not really seen. It's not visible. So that's another brilliant conversation. And I'm just wondering, with all the hats that you're already wearing as researcher and outreach coordinator, how are you managing motherhood in STEM as well? What has that experience been like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad to have a chance to talk about it. And actually, that article also ended up, I feel like it was either in Science or Nature, but they did a commentary about women being pregnant in the field. It was wonderful. And so I jokingly say that was the first time I brought my son to the field. The second time I brought my son to the field, he was 6 years old. But, it's when I was thinking about starting a family, and I went to various conferences, I went up to almost every woman who I knew that I had found out had kids, had brought them to the field, had not brought them to the field, and just said, how did you do it? And what has been wonderful is that I have never had someone say, I don't want to talk about that, because everybody is, my women mentors, female mentors have been, and even, women who I don't even know very well are really interested in trying to support women who are interested in being in science, doing field work. I think everybody sort of does it differently. And, I do wear several hats, and one is my mom hat. And, I never really take that one off, I guess. And, sometimes I juggle things precariously, I guess. It's always a little bit of a balancing act, and that changes depending on what my research is and what I'm working on, and, what my son is doing at that point. And, I have a wonderful husband who's really supportive so that I can go off to the field, on my own now. And I have been since the beginning, really. I love talking to other, women and anybody who has tried to, create that balance. And again, everybody does a little differently. And I think there's a lesson in that, is that, like, there's no right way to do it. There's no wrong way to do it. Whatever way works for you and feels right. And I kind of feel like that with most parenting things, honestly. It's like, there's a lot of talk out there. And, taking my son to the field was wonderful. It was also really challenging. And so, there will be sort of, right times to do that and times when it's not going to work very well. And I think all of that is okay.
Yeah, it's so important. It's hard with so many expectations out there. As a field worker myself, and having known a lot of people in the primatology, I know plenty of people who've taken their, and many of them women, some as families where maybe both partners are also field workers, but who've taken their kids out to the field. And yeah, it looks hard, but I mean, it's certainly rewarding. And I mean, everyone has to forge their own way to make things work rather than trying to put one off against the other. Kasha knows that I've taken my kids, my older son, I've taken him to the field a couple of times. And it's very rewarding, but it's also, as Kasha might also recognize, I was a little bit, not as engaged as I would normally have been, but there's so much value to that too, as a research. And I wonder how having your son in the field with you, that made you look at what you're doing differently in some ways.
I don't know if it's made me look at things differently, but I think it has certainly, it's given me a really deep respect for all of my colleagues' choices, whether that choice is bring the whole family to the field, whether that choice is, bring my child and a caregiver to the field, whether that choice is, this is not going to work this time, I'm coming on my own. And I think, all of those choices are valid choices.
Do you think it's getting easier as well? Should I have hope?
Oh, yes. That's what I was going to say. Actually, one of the reasons why I wanted to write that, it was a Smithsonian Magazine blog post, is to show that it can be done. And I think the more often we see colleagues doing this, I think the better for younger, women, men, everybody who are going, well, but I would like to do this kind of research, but I want to have a family. Is that even possible? It's absolutely possible. So I think it's getting easier because there's more models, there's more acceptance, and the more, the more parents that are in the field doing field work with their kids, without their kids, talking about it, I think it really does make it easier. And I think also now with, some granting agencies will even provide funding for you to bring, a caregiver to the field. That kind of stuff really helps, with equity for people that can't leave the child behind and can't do it without a caregiver. So.
God, it's such an important point. I mean, you just think about the accessibility to this kind of work. If you want to have a regular life and a family, I mean, it just becomes so impossible for some people to imagine how. So I'm really happy you brought that up. And I mean, if we can get more grantors on board with that, yes, that would be fantastic.
Agreed. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, Dr. Briana Pobiner, thank you so much for joining us on the PrimateCast. It was a pleasure.
Oh, thanks for having me. I had fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the PrimateCast. The podcast is hosted and produced by me, Dr. Andrew McIntosh, Senior Scientist for Wildlife Conservation at the Wilder Institute, Calgary Zoo, formerly Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at Kyoto University. Join me for new episodes as often as I can get them out on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Leave a rating or a review of the show to help other listeners find it. Connect with me through our website, theprimatecast.info, or social media on X, Facebook, or Instagram. Feel free to comment, ask questions, suggest future guests, or share whatever else might be on your mind. If you value the show, consider donating or becoming a member. You can do so by visiting theprimatecast.info and clicking on the big yellow Buy Me a Mic button, which takes you to our campaign page. Or you could click on that little heart icon next to the social media links in your podcast player, or on the text link in the show notes. Your support will help cover production costs and is essential to ensure that I can continue to produce quality informational and inspirational interviews with leading figures in the field long into the future.